A black nanny is falsely accused by the longtime housekeeper of a wealthy family after she manages to get two children who haven't slept properly in 8 months to fall soundly asleep on her very first day. The housekeeper suspects she drugged the children, but when the housekeeper secretly searches the nanny's belongings, the books and documents she finds leave her stunned. Everything she's built over the last 12 years is about to fall apart. Before we go back, let us know where you're watching from. And subscribe, because tomorrow I've got something extra special for you. Mr. Morrison, that woman is drugging your children. The accusation shattered the morning silence in the marble foyer of the Beverly Hills mansion like a gunshot. Patricia Wells, the 58-year-old head housekeeper, stood with her arms crossed tightly against her chest, her weathered hands trembling slightly as she pointed toward the kitchen, where soft laughter could be heard for the first time in 8 months. Vincent Morrison looked up from his untouched coffee, his bloodshot eyes moving between his trusted housekeeper of 12 years and the closed kitchen door, where his 5-year-old twin sons, Ethan and Evan, were eating breakfast without screaming, without throwing food, without the soul-crushing tantrums that had become their daily routine since their mother's death. "Patricia, that's a very serious accusation," Vincent said quietly, setting down his cup with hands that still shook slightly whenever he had to make important decisions. The 45-year-old real estate mogul had aged a decade in the past 8 months, his once pristine appearance now marked by perpetual exhaustion and the kind of desperate hope that comes from watching your children suffer and being powerless to help them. Patricia's lips pressed into a thin line as she stepped closer to Vincent's chair, her voice dropping to an urgent whisper. "Listen to me, Mr. Morrison. Those boys haven't slept through the night since Mrs. Sarah died. They screamed until 3 in the morning every single night for 8 months straight. 6 nannies quit because they couldn't handle the crying, the nightmares, the way Ethan would hide under his bed, and Evan would scratch at the walls until his fingernails bled." Her voice cracked slightly as she continued. "And then this woman shows up from Detroit with no proper references from respectable families, and suddenly your sons are sleeping 8 hours straight and eating their vegetables like perfect little angels. Something is very, very wrong here." The kitchen door swung open and Zara Washington emerged, carrying 2 empty breakfast plates and moving with the kind of quiet confidence that had unsettled Patricia from the very first day. At 30 years old, Zara possessed an almost unsettling calmness that seemed to intensify whenever tensions rose around her. Her dark eyes swept the foyer, taking in Patricia's rigid posture and Vincent's conflicted expression with the analytical precision of someone accustomed to reading people's deepest fears and motivations. "Good morning, Mr. Morrison," Zara said, her voice carrying a warmth that somehow made Patricia's accusations sound even more harsh in comparison. "The boys finished their entire breakfast today. Ethan even asked for seconds on the scrambled eggs." She paused, her gaze shifting to Patricia with a slight tilt of her head that could have been curiosity or something far more calculating. "Is everything all right? You both look troubled." Patricia's face flushed red as she stepped forward, her 12 years of authority in the Morrison household giving her voice a sharp edge. "Don't you dare pretend you don't know what this is about. I've been watching you, taking notes, documenting everything. The way you disappear into your room for hours at night, the strange phone calls, the way you seem to know exactly what those children need before they even ask for it." Her breathing became more rapid as her suspicions poured out. No one is that good with traumatized children unless they're using methods that aren't natural. Zara listened to the tirade with an expression of mild interest, as if Patricia were describing the weather rather than accusing her of child endangerment. When Patricia finally paused for breath, Zara set the plates down on the side table with deliberate care and folded her hands in front of her. "Mrs. Wells, I understand your concern for Ethan and Evan's well-being. In fact, I respect it." Her tone remained perfectly level, which only seemed to agitate Patricia more. "If you truly believe I'm doing something harmful to these children, I suggest we install cameras in their bedroom. That way, everyone can see exactly what happens during our nighttime routines." The suggestion hit the room like a physical blow. Vincent's head snapped up, his tired eyes focusing with sudden sharpness on Zara's serene face. Patricia's mouth opened and closed wordlessly, her confidence wavering for the first time since she'd launched her attack. A guilty person would never volunteer for more surveillance, would never invite scrutiny into their private moments with the children. The logical part of Vincent's mind recognized this immediately, but the desperate, exhausted part of him that had watched his son suffer for months couldn't ignore Patricia's concerns entirely. "Cameras," Patricia stammered, her voice losing some of its earlier conviction. "Well, that's not necessarily... I mean, if you're willing to..." She trailed off, realizing that her own reluctance to pursue the very evidence she demanded made her look foolish. Zara reached into her pocket and pulled out her smartphone, scrolling through it with the casual efficiency of someone who had nothing to hide. "Actually, Mrs. Wells, I've already been recording some of our nighttime routines to document the boys' progress for my own professional development. Would you like to see?" The offer hung in the air like a challenge, and Patricia's face went from red to pale in a matter of seconds. Vincent stood up slowly, his businessman's instincts finally overriding his parental desperation. "Professional development? Zara, what exactly is your professional background?" The question had been nagging at him for weeks, ever since he'd noticed that his new nanny spoke 4 languages fluently, quoted child psychology studies with academic precision, and commanded respect from everyone she met, including his business associates who had stopped by the house for meetings. "I have a master's degree in child psychology from Stanford University," Zara replied simply, as if she were mentioning the weather. "I specialized in pediatric trauma recovery and worked at 3 different children's hospitals before starting my own practice." She paused, watching Vincent's expression shift from confusion to amazement. "The question you should be asking, Mr. Morrison, is why someone with my qualifications would take a position that pays 1/10 of what I used to earn." The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of small feet running down the hallway and the bright voices of children who sounded genuinely happy for the first time since their world had been shattered by tragedy. Ethan and Evan burst into the foyer, their faces flushed from playing, their eyes bright with the kind of joy that had seemed impossible just weeks before. "Daddy, Zara, we found a bird's nest in the garden," Ethan announced, tugging on Vincent's sleeve with the casual affection of a child who felt safe in his own home again. Evan nodded enthusiastically, wrapping his small arms around Zara's waist with the absolute trust that only children can give to the adults who truly understand them. Vincent watched his sons really watch them and saw something he had almost forgotten existed. They were laughing. They were touching people without flinching. They were children again, not the hollow-eyed, terrified shells they had become after watching their mother's funeral from the front row of a church filled with adults who had no idea how to help them heal. As he knelt down to hear about their discovery, Vincent caught Patricia's eye over the boys' heads and saw something there that made his stomach clench with a cold, uncomfortable realization. It wasn't concern for the children's safety he saw in her expression. It was fear of losing control, fear of being replaced, and underneath it all, something that looked disturbingly like resentment toward the woman who had succeeded where she had failed. "Boys, why don't you go wash your hands and get ready for your art lesson?" Zara suggested gently, and the twins raced off without argument, without tears, without the resistance that had characterized their every interaction with adults for the past 8 months. When they were gone, the foyer fell silent again. But now the tension had shifted. Patricia's accusations hung in the air like smoke from a fire that was rapidly burning out, while Vincent found himself looking at Zara with new eyes and wondering what other secrets the woman who had saved his family might be carrying. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of the Morrison mansion, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air like tiny witnesses to a confrontation that was far from over. Because while Patricia's accusations had been deflected for now, Vincent was beginning to suspect that his mysterious nanny had her own agenda, one that went much deeper than simply caring for 2 traumatized children. And in the back of his mind, a small voice was asking the same question that Patricia had raised, though for very different reasons. Exactly who was Zara Washington, and what had really brought her to his family's door? That afternoon, while Zara took the twins to their swimming lesson at the country club, Patricia Wells stood outside the nanny's bedroom door with her master key trembling in her hand. 12 years of managing the Morrison household had given her access to every corner of the mansion, every drawer, every closet, but she had never felt like such a trespasser in her own domain. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she turned the key, the soft click of the lock echoing in the empty hallway like a gunshot. She told herself she was protecting the family, that Vincent's obvious infatuation with their mysterious employee was clouding his judgment. But deep down, Patricia knew her motivations were far more complicated than simple concern for the children's welfare. The room was immaculate, almost militarily precise in its organization. The bed was made with hospital corners, the few personal items arranged with mathematical precision on the dresser, and not a single piece of clothing out of place. But it was what Patricia found in the desk drawer that made her breath catch in her throat. Textbooks on child psychology, trauma recovery, and behavioral modification were stacked neatly beside certificates from Stanford University and recommendation letters from Detroit Children's Hospital. Her hands shook as she flipped through a leather-bound journal filled with detailed notes about Ethan and Evan's sleeping patterns, eating habits, and emotional responses, all written in the precise handwriting of someone accustomed to clinical documentation. "Jesus Christ," Patricia whispered, sinking into the desk chair as the implications hit her like a physical blow. This wasn't some desperate woman from the inner city looking for easy money from a wealthy family. This was a trained professional, someone with advanced degrees and years of experience, someone who could have commanded six-figure salaries at any hospital in the country. The question that sent ice through Patricia's veins was simple and terrifying. What was someone like this really doing in their home? She found the small digital recorder hidden beneath a stack of children's books, its red light blinking to indicate recent use. Patricia's mouth went dry as she realized that every conversation, every private moment in the house might have been captured and stored by someone whose true intentions remained completely unknown. Her fingers fumbled with the device until she managed to access the most recent recordings, and what she heard made her stomach lurch with a mixture of vindication and terror. Zara's voice came through the tiny speaker with crystal clarity. Day 21. Ethan's night terrors have decreased by 70% since implementing the new routine. Evan is showing signs of attachment recovery and has begun seeking physical comfort again. There was a pause, and then, Vincent Morrison's guilt over his wife's death is making him vulnerable to emotional manipulation. Patricia Wells continues to demonstrate classic signs of territorial aggression and appears to be the primary obstacle to full environmental stabilization. Patricia's hands flew to her mouth to stifle a gasp. Environmental stabilization, emotional manipulation, territorial aggression. These weren't the words of a caring nanny. They were the clinical observations of someone conducting an experiment, someone studying their family like laboratory rats. She fumbled for her phone, her fingers barely managing to dial Vincent's number as panic flooded her system. "Mr. Morrison, you need to come home immediately," she whispered into the phone, her voice cracking with urgency. "I found something in her room. Equipment, documents. She's been recording us, studying us. This woman isn't who she says she is." Vincent's voice came through the speaker, sharp with concern. "Patricia, slow down. What exactly did you find?" "Professional psychology textbooks, recording devices, detailed notes about all of us written like we're research subjects. Vincent, she has a master's degree from Stanford. She's been working at hospitals. Someone with her qualifications doesn't take a nanny job unless they have an agenda." Patricia's voice rose with each word as her fear transformed into desperate certainty. "She's been lying to us from day one. The question is why?" The line went quiet for a long moment, and Patricia could hear the sounds of children playing in the background, the normal sounds of a family enjoying an afternoon together. When Vincent spoke again, his voice carried a weight that hadn't been there before. "I'll be home in 20 minutes. Don't touch anything else, and don't let her know you were in her room." But as Patricia hung up the phone and looked around the precisely organized space one more time, she realized with growing dread that someone like Zara Washington, someone who planned everything with such meticulous care, probably already knew exactly what Patricia had discovered. The real question was whether this had been part of her plan all along. The next 3 hours passed like a slow-motion nightmare for Patricia. She tried to maintain her normal routine, preparing dinner and organizing the household schedule. But her hands shook every time she touched anything, and she jumped at every sound. When she heard Vincent's car pull into the driveway earlier than expected, her heart rate spiked so dramatically that she had to grip the kitchen counter to keep from fainting. Through the window, she watched him sit in his Mercedes for several long minutes, his head in his hands, clearly struggling with the implications of what she had told him. The grandfather clock in the hallway had just chimed 7 when Patricia heard the front door open and Zara's gentle voice calling out that they were back from swimming. Patricia positioned herself in the kitchen doorway, watching as Ethan and Evan ran to their father with wet hair and bright smiles, chattering excitedly about their lesson while Zara followed at a respectful distance. But now, Patricia saw everything through different eyes. The way Zara's dark gaze swept the room, cataloging every detail. The careful distance she maintained while still remaining close enough to intervene if needed. The professional calm that never wavered, no matter what chaos erupted around her. "Daddy, Zara taught us how to float on our backs without being scared," Evan announced, wrapping his small arms around Vincent's waist. "She said our mama is watching us from the stars, and she would be proud of how brave we're being." Vincent's eyes met Zara's over his son's head, and Patricia saw something pass between them that made her stomach clench with a mixture of jealousy and genuine fear. It wasn't just gratitude in Vincent's expression. It was the kind of trust and admiration that she had spent 12 years trying to earn, given freely to a woman who had been in their lives for less than a month. And in Zara's responding smile, Patricia glimpsed something that terrified her more than any hidden agenda or secret recording. Genuine affection for the children, real concern for their well-being, and the kind of professional competence that made Patricia's own contributions to the household seem insignificant by comparison. "Boys, why don't you go change into dry clothes and wash your hands for dinner?" Zara suggested, and they ran off without argument, their laughter echoing through the house like music Vincent hadn't heard since Sarah's death. When they were gone, the atmosphere in the foyer shifted dramatically. Vincent's expression grew serious, and Patricia felt the weight of everything she had discovered pressing down on her like a physical force. Zara turned her attention to Vincent with that unsettling directness that had marked all of their interactions. "Mr. Morrison, is everything all right? You seem tense, and Mrs. Wells appears to be quite upset about something." Her tone was perfectly neutral, but Patricia caught the slight emphasis on the word upset and realized with growing horror that Zara knew exactly what had happened that afternoon. Vincent glanced toward Patricia, then back to Zara with an expression of growing confusion and concern. "Actually, Zara, there are some questions I need to ask you about your background, your qualifications, your reasons for taking this position." He paused, clearly struggling with how to proceed without alienating the woman who had given him back his children's happiness. "Patricia found some things in your room that suggest you might not have been entirely forthcoming about who you are and why you're here." Instead of the defensive reaction Patricia expected, instead of anger or denials or attempts to explain away the evidence, Zara simply nodded as if she had been waiting for this conversation all along. There was something almost relieved in her expression, as if maintaining her cover had been more exhausting than anyone realized. "I see. Mrs. Wells conducted a search of my private quarters." She looked directly at Patricia, who felt exposed and foolish under that calm, analytical gaze. "I suppose it was inevitable. Fear makes people do things they would never normally consider." She turned back to Vincent, her hands folded calmly in front of her, and Patricia noticed for the first time that there was something different about Zara's posture now. The deferential air she had always maintained around Vincent was gone, replaced by the quiet authority of someone accustomed to being in charge of difficult situations. "You're right, Mr. Morrison. I haven't been entirely forthcoming about my background or my reasons for being here. The question is whether you're prepared to hear the truth. Because once I tell you everything, there will be no going back to the comfortable assumptions you've been making about your family, your business, and the people you trust." The air in the foyer seemed to grow thick with tension as Patricia realized that whatever game Zara had been playing was about to reach its climax. And despite her fear, despite her certainty that this woman represented a threat to everything she had built over 12 years of faithful service, Patricia found herself desperate to know what secrets lay behind those calm, calculating eyes and what had really brought Zara Washington into their lives. Because somewhere in the back of her mind, a terrible possibility was beginning to form. What if everything she thought she knew about this situation was wrong? What if the real threat to the Morrison family wasn't Zara Washington at all? Vincent Morrison stood in his own foyer, feeling like a stranger in his own home, caught between the woman who had served his family faithfully for 12 years and the mysterious nanny who had performed what could only be described as miracles with his traumatized sons. The weight of Patricia's discoveries pressed against his chest like a physical force, but something in Zara's calm demeanor suggested that he was about to learn truths that would reshape everything he thought he knew about the people in his life. "Zara," he said slowly, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to boardroom negotiations, but tempered by the uncertainty of a father who had watched his children suffer. "I need you to tell me exactly who you are and what you're really doing in my home." Zara Washington looked at him for a long moment, and Patricia noticed that the careful mask of deference the nanny had always worn was finally slipping away, replaced by something that looked disturbingly like pity. "My name is Dr. Zara Washington. I hold a doctorate in child psychology from Stanford University and a master's degree in trauma recovery from Johns Hopkins. For the past 8 years, I've been the head of pediatric psychological services at Detroit Children's Hospital, specializing in cases involving childhood grief and family dysfunction." She paused, allowing the implications to settle over Vincent like a cold blanket. "6 months ago, I closed my practice and resigned from my position to come here, to your home, for one very specific reason." Patricia felt her legs go weak as the careful narrative she had constructed about their mysterious nanny crumbled completely. This wasn't some opportunistic woman looking to take advantage of a wealthy widower. This was a doctor, someone who had given up a prestigious career and substantial income to work as their children's caregiver. The question that hammered against Patricia's skull was simple and terrifying. Why would someone make such a sacrifice unless they had a personal stake in the outcome? "6 months ago," Zara continued, her voice taking on a harder edge that neither Vincent nor Patricia had ever heard before, "your company, Morrison Industries, fired an employee named Marcus Washington. Do you remember him, Mr. Morrison?" Vincent's face went pale as recognition dawned. Marcus Washington had been a brilliant structural engineer, one of the most innovative designers they had ever employed, responsible for the eco-friendly housing project that had won Morrison Industries 3 major awards and generated over $50 million in revenue. "Marcus," Vincent said slowly, his mind racing through the implications. "Yes, I remember. There were some concerns about his fit with the company culture, some complaints from other employees about his attitude, suggestions that he might be happier elsewhere." Even as he spoke the words, Vincent could hear how hollow they sounded, how much like corporate doublespeak, designed to mask uncomfortable truths. Zara's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. "Concerns about his fit with company culture. That's an interesting way to describe systematic racial discrimination, Mr. Morrison. Marcus Washington is my brother." The revelation hit the room like a physical blow, sucking all the air out of the space and leaving Vincent staggering backward as if he had been struck. Patricia's hand flew to her throat, her worst fears confirmed in a way that was somehow even more devastating than she had imagined. "Your brother was fired because Mrs. Wells here," Zara gestured toward Patricia with clinical precision, "made it her personal mission to convince your human resources department that employees like Marcus didn't represent the right image for Morrison Industries. She attended company social events, chatted with your executives' wives, dropped subtle suggestions about which employees seemed to understand the company's values and which ones might be more comfortable in different environments." Patricia's face drained of all color as Zara continued. "She's very good at it, actually. Never says anything directly discriminatory, never leaves evidence that could be used in a lawsuit, just plants seeds of doubt and lets other people's prejudices do the rest of the work." Vincent turned to look at Patricia with growing horror, but the housekeeper was staring at Zara with an expression of pure terror. "How do you know about private conversations? How could you possibly have access to internal company communications?" Her voice cracked with desperation as she realized that her carefully constructed world was collapsing around her. Zara reached into her pocket and pulled out a tablet, scrolling through it with the casual efficiency of someone who had been preparing for this moment for months. "Because Mrs. Wells, when my brother was fired 2 days before his wife gave birth to their 3rd child, when he spent 4 months unemployed and nearly lost his home because no other company would hire someone who had been let go from the prestigious Morrison Industries, I decided to conduct a very thorough investigation into exactly what had happened." She looked up from the tablet, her dark eyes boring into Patricia's with laser intensity. I discovered that over the past 3 years, Morrison Industries has fired or forced out 16 employees of color, and in 68% of those cases, there were documented communications between Mrs. Wells and company executives expressing concerns about cultural fit or professional compatibility. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of children's laughter drifting down from upstairs, a reminder of the innocent lives caught in the middle of this adult drama. Vincent felt his knees give out slightly, and he gripped the back of a chair for support as the full magnitude of what he was hearing began to penetrate his consciousness. "Patricia," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper, "is this true? Have you been influencing my business decisions based on personal prejudices?" Patricia's mouth opened and closed wordlessly, her 12 years of careful manipulation suddenly exposed to the harsh light of scrutiny. "Mr. Morrison, you have to understand. I was protecting the company's reputation, maintaining standards that your father and grandfather built over decades. Some people, they just don't understand our way of doing things. They don't appreciate the traditions that make Morrison Industries special." Her voice grew stronger as she fell back on justifications she had been rehearsing in her mind for years. "I never said anything untrue, never made false accusations. I simply shared my observations about which employees seem to embody the company's values." Zara looked at Patricia with something that might have been compassion if it weren't so cold. "Your observations. Let me share some of my observations, Mrs. Wells." She scrolled to another section of her tablet and began reading in a voice devoid of emotion. Email to Jennifer Morrison, wife of the CFO, dated March 15th. "I hope I'm not speaking out of turn, but I've noticed that Marcus Washington seems to have difficulty connecting with our established client base. Perhaps someone with a more traditional background might be better suited for the Morrison account." She looked up at Patricia, whose face had gone from pale to gray. "Traditional background, that's a very creative way to say white, Mrs. Wells." Vincent felt something cold and heavy settling in his stomach as he began to understand the full scope of what had been happening under his nose. "How many people, Patricia? How many careers have you destroyed with your observations and concerns?" Before Patricia could answer, Zara continued reading. Text message to Rebecca Thompson, head of human resources, dated June 22nd. "Vincent seems quite taken with that new architect, David Miller, but I wonder if someone of his background would really understand our high-end clientele. The Worthington project requires such delicate handling." She set the tablet down and looked directly at Vincent. "David Miller, the architect who designed your award-winning sustainable housing complex, forced to transfer to the Municipal Projects Division after Mrs. Wells expressed concerns about his ability to relate to wealthy clients." Patricia's composure finally cracked completely. "How do you have access to private text messages? This is invasion of privacy, corporate espionage. Mr. Morrison, she's here to destroy us, to sue the company, to ruin everything we've built." Her voice rose to a near shriek as desperation overrode years of careful self-control. Zara's expression didn't change, but there was something almost gentle in her voice when she responded. "Mrs. Wells, everything I've shared with Mr. Morrison came from legal discovery requests filed by the 8 families who are currently pursuing discrimination lawsuits against Morrison Industries. You see, when you systematically destroy people's careers based on racial prejudice, some of them fight back. And when they fight back, they hire lawyers who are very good at obtaining evidence." The room fell into stunned silence as Vincent processed the revelation that his company was facing multiple discrimination lawsuits that he knew nothing about because they had been carefully hidden from him by the very people he trusted to manage such matters. 8 lawsuits, he repeated numbly. "How is it possible that I don't know about 8 discrimination lawsuits against my own company?" "Because," Zara said with the clinical precision of someone presenting a medical diagnosis, "Mrs. Wells here has been working with certain members of your legal and human resources departments to handle these matters quietly, to settle them out of court with non-disclosure agreements that prevent the victims from discussing their experiences publicly. It's been quite an effective system for maintaining the company's reputation while continuing the pattern of discriminatory behavior." Patricia made one final, desperate attempt to regain control of the situation. Mr. Morrison, don't you see what she's doing? She's manipulating you, using your guilt about your wife's death and your gratitude for what she's done with the children to make you turn against people who have served your family loyally for years. This woman is dangerous. She's been recording our private conversations, studying our family like we're test subjects. Whatever agenda she has, it's not about helping your children. But as Patricia spoke, Vincent found himself looking at Zara with new eyes, seeing not the mysterious threat that Patricia had painted her as, but a woman who had sacrificed her career and comfort to seek justice for her family and for other families who had been wronged by the system he had unknowingly allowed to flourish. "Actually, Mrs. Wells," he said quietly, his voice carrying a weight that made both women turn to look at him, "I think Dr. Washington's agenda is exactly about helping my children. She's helping them grow up in a world where competence and character matter more than skin color, where their father's company represents fairness and opportunity rather than exclusion and prejudice." He turned to Zara, his expression a mixture of shame and determination. "Dr. Washington, what do you need from me to make this right? Not just for your brother, but for all the families who have been hurt by the culture that I allowed to exist in my company?" Zara studied his face for a long moment, as if evaluating his sincerity, before nodding slowly. "First, Mrs. Wells needs to be removed from any position where she can influence business decisions or employee relations. Second, every person who was fired or forced out due to her influence needs to be contacted with offers of reinstatement or appropriate compensation. Third, your company needs to implement transparent hiring and evaluation processes that eliminate the possibility of this kind of discrimination in the future." She paused, her expression softening slightly. "And fourth, your sons need to grow up understanding that diversity and inclusion aren't just corporate buzzwords, but fundamental principles that determine what kind of men they become." As Patricia realized that her 12 years of power and influence were coming to an end, as Vincent began to grasp the full extent of the changes he would need to make, the sound of small feet running down the stairs reminded them all that this confrontation was ultimately about more than corporate politics or personal vendettas. It was about the kind of world they were creating for Ethan and Evan Morrison, and whether that world would be defined by the prejudices of the past or the possibilities of a more just future. The sound of Ethan and Evan's footsteps on the marble staircase seemed to echo through the mansion like a countdown to judgment, their innocent voices calling out, "Daddy, Zara," as they descended into a world that had fundamentally changed in the space of a single conversation. Vincent Morrison stood frozen in his foyer, the weight of his company's systematic discrimination pressing down on him like a physical force, while Patricia Wells gripped the back of a chair with white knuckles, her 12 years of carefully constructed influence crumbling around her like a house of cards in a hurricane. But it was Zara Washington who commanded the room now, her calm authority filling the space as she prepared to reveal the true scope of her mission. "Boys, perfect timing," Zara said as the twins reached the bottom of the stairs, her voice carrying the same gentle warmth it always had, though Patricia could now hear the steel beneath the softness. "Why don't you show your daddy the drawing you made yesterday about our family?" Ethan and Evan exchanged excited glances before racing back upstairs to retrieve their artwork, their laughter a stark contrast to the heavy tension that had settled over the adults. When the children's voices faded into the distance, Zara turned back to Vincent with an expression that was both compassionate and implacable. "Mr. Morrison, before we continue, I need you to understand something crucial about my presence here. When I closed my practice and gave up my 6-figure salary to become your children's nanny, it wasn't because I was desperate for revenge against the people who hurt my brother. It was because I had spent 8 years treating children who were casualties of adult prejudice and dysfunction, and I couldn't stand by and watch 2 more innocent victims suffer while the system that created their trauma remained unchanged." Patricia found her voice, though it came out as little more than a whisper. "What do you mean, casualties of adult prejudice? Ethan and Evan lost their mother in an accident. That has nothing to do with race or discrimination." Zara's gaze settled on Patricia with clinical precision. "Doesn't it, Mrs. Wells? Tell me, in the 8 months since Sarah Morrison's death, how many qualified child psychologists did you reject for this position because they didn't fit your idea of appropriate help for a family of this social standing?" How many trauma specialists were dismissed because you decided they wouldn't understand the Morrison family's particular needs? Patricia's face went ashen as Zara continued. I have the records, Mrs. Wells. 17 highly qualified professionals were rejected before the agency finally sent me, and in 14 of those cases, your input was the deciding factor. Vincent felt something cold and terrible settling in his chest as he began to understand the full scope of what had been happening in his own home. You mean my sons could have been getting professional help months ago? Their suffering could have been ended, but Patricia was screening out qualified doctors because of her personal prejudices. Your sons have been trapped in a cycle of untreated trauma, not because appropriate help wasn't available, but because the gatekeeper of your household had very specific ideas about what kind of person should have access to your family, Zara replied, her voice remaining calm even as she delivered devastating truths. Mrs. Wells consistently recommended candidates with minimal qualifications, but the right social background over licensed professionals who could have actually helped your children heal. Patricia made one desperate attempt to defend herself. I was protecting the family's privacy, maintaining discretion about our personal matters. Some people, they gossip. They share information inappropriately. I couldn't risk having our private business spread around the community. Zara pulled out her tablet again, scrolling to a section filled with notes and documentation. Protection and discretion. Interesting words choice, Mrs. Wells. She looked up with an expression that was almost sympathetic. Is that why you told the Henderson family at last month's charity gala that the Morrison children were becoming unmanageable and that Mr. Morrison was considering sending them to boarding school? Or why you suggested to 3 different families that Mr. Morrison might be suffering from depression and poor judgment following his wife's death? The color drained from Vincent's face as he realized that Patricia had been discussing his family's private struggles with their social circle, undermining his reputation while simultaneously blocking access to professional help that could have ended his children's suffering months earlier. Patricia, he said quietly, his voice carrying a dangerous undertone that made the housekeeper step backward. You discussed my mental health and my children's trauma with other families? People were asking questions, showing concern, Patricia stammered, her carefully maintained composure finally cracking completely. The children were so difficult, everyone could see something was wrong. I had to provide some explanation for their behavior when we were in public. Zara's expression hardened as she continued reading from her tablet. Explanation. Yes, let's talk about your explanations, Mrs. Wells. According to Jennifer Morrison, wife of your CFO, you suggested that the children's behavioral problems might be genetic, inherited from their mother's side of the family. You told Rebecca Thompson that Sarah Morrison had always been unstable, and that her death might have been more complicated than a simple accident. The room fell into stunned silence as the implications of Patricia's gossip campaign became clear. Vincent's hands began to shake as rage and grief warred for control of his emotions. You told people that my wife's death wasn't an accident. You suggested that Sarah was unstable. She died in a car crash caused by a drunk driver, Patricia. She was the most mentally healthy person I've ever known. But people needed to understand why the children were so difficult to manage, Patricia said desperately. I couldn't let them think you were an incompetent father or that the Morrison family was falling apart. I had to give them a reason that would preserve your reputation while explaining the children's problems. Zara closed her tablet and looked at Patricia with something that might have been pity if it weren't so cold. So you decided to destroy a dead woman's reputation to protect a living man's image, while simultaneously ensuring that her children couldn't access the professional help they needed to heal from their trauma. That's a very particular kind of loyalty, Mrs. Wells. The sound of small feet running down the stairs interrupted the confrontation as Ethan and Evan returned with their drawing, a colorful crayon masterpiece that showed 4 figures holding hands in front of a house. Look, Daddy, Ethan announced proudly. It's our family, you and me and Evan and Zara. The innocent joy in his voice was like a knife through Vincent's heart as he realized how close he had come to losing this happiness. How Patricia's interference had nearly cost his sons months of additional suffering. Vincent knelt down to examine the drawing, his eyes filling with tears, as he saw how his children had instinctively created a new family structure that included the woman who had saved them. It's beautiful, boys. Absolutely beautiful. When he looked up at Zara, his expression was filled with a mixture of gratitude and determination. "Dr. Washington, I want to make this right, not just for my family, but for everyone who has been hurt by the culture I allowed to exist in my company and my home." Zara studied his face carefully, as if evaluating his sincerity. "Making it right won't be simple, Mr. Morrison. It will require more than just firing Mrs. Wells and issuing apologies. You'll need to restructure your entire approach to hiring, promotion, and workplace culture. You'll need to bring in outside consultants to audit your practices and implement systems that prevent this kind of discrimination from happening again. Most importantly, you'll need to personally contact every family that has been harmed and work with them to determine appropriate restitution." "Whatever it takes," Vincent said without hesitation. "My company will implement transparent hiring practices, sensitivity training for all management personnel, and an independent oversight committee to monitor our compliance with anti-discrimination policies. Every person who is unfairly terminated will receive offers of reinstatement at higher positions with full back pay or compensation packages that reflect the opportunities they lost." Patricia made one final desperate play for sympathy. "Mr. Morrison, after 12 years of loyal service, doesn't my dedication to this family count for anything? I've devoted my entire adult life to maintaining your household, protecting your reputation, ensuring that everything ran smoothly so you could focus on your business." Vincent turned to look at her with an expression that was more sad than angry. "Patricia, your dedication was real, but it was built on a foundation of prejudice that hurt innocent people and nearly destroyed my children's chance at healing. Loyalty that requires the exclusion and degradation of others isn't loyalty at all. It's complicity in a system that makes the world worse for everyone." Zara reached into her briefcase and pulled out a thick folder filled with documents. "There's one more thing you need to know, Mr. Morrison. Mrs. Wells didn't just influence hiring decisions at your company. She's been part of a network of household managers throughout Beverly Hills who share information and coordinate their efforts to maintain what they call community standards." She opened the folder to reveal email chains, phone logs, and meeting notes. 12 different families, 43 employees affected over the past 5 years, all connected by a group of domestic staff who have taken it upon themselves to police the racial composition of their employers' businesses and social circles. The revelation hit Vincent like a physical blow as he realized that the discrimination in his company wasn't an isolated problem, but part of a coordinated effort spanning multiple businesses and social networks. "You're telling me that there's been an organized campaign to exclude people of color from employment and social opportunities throughout our entire community? What I'm telling you," Zara said with quiet intensity, "is that systemic racism doesn't happen by accident. It requires coordination, communication, and the complicity of people who benefit from maintaining the status quo. Mrs. Wells and her network have been very effective at preserving their vision of community standards, but their success has come at the cost of dozens of careers, hundreds of opportunities, and countless families who have been denied access to the prosperity that should be available to everyone based on merit alone." As Patricia finally began to understand that her world of influence and control was ending forever, as Vincent grappled with the scope of the changes he would need to implement, the innocent laughter of Ethan and Evan playing in the next room served as a reminder that this confrontation was ultimately about creating a better future for the next generation. The question that hung in the air was whether the adults in that marble foyer would have the courage to dismantle a system that had benefited them in order to build something more just for the children who would inherit the consequences of their choices. But Zara Washington had one final revelation that would transform this story from a tale of individual prejudice into something much larger, something that would challenge not just the Morrison family, but the entire power structure of their community. Because the network she had uncovered reached far beyond domestic staff and into the highest levels of business, politics, and social influence, and the evidence she had gathered was about to expose connections that would shake the foundations of how an entire city thought about power, privilege, and the price of maintaining both. 1 year later, the Morrison mansion buzzed with the kind of joyful chaos that had been absent from its marble halls for far too long. The dining room table, which had once hosted silent, tension-filled meals, now accommodated 8 people gathered for Sunday dinner. Vincent and his sons, Zara and her brother Marcus, with his wife Linda and their 3 children, creating a blended family that transcended traditional boundaries and proved that love could indeed triumph over prejudice. The laughter of 5 children echoed through rooms that had once been filled with the sounds of grief and trauma, while the adults shared stories and dreams over a meal that represented not just nourishment for the body, but healing for souls that had been wounded by years of systematic injustice. Vincent Morrison looked around the table at faces that had become as precious to him as his own sons, marveling at how completely his world had been transformed by a woman who had entered his life under false pretenses, but with the purest of intentions. Marcus Washington sat at his right hand, no longer the broken man who had been crushed by unemployment and discrimination, but the newly appointed Vice President of Sustainable Development at Morrison Industries, a position created specifically to harness his innovative vision for affordable housing that could serve communities of all economic levels. The irony wasn't lost on Vincent that the man Patricia had deemed unfit for his company had become one of its most valuable assets, generating over $20 million in new contracts and earning recognition from the American Institute of Architects for his groundbreaking designs. Uncle Vincent called out Marcus's oldest daughter, 8-year-old Amelia, her voice bright with the confidence of a child who had grown up seeing her father's worth validated rather than dismissed. "Daddy says you're going to build playgrounds in all the new houses. Can we help design them?" The question prompted enthusiastic responses from all the children, including Ethan and Evan, who had blossomed into empathetic, curious boys whose trauma had been replaced by resilience and whose worldview had been shaped by exposure to diversity rather than exclusion. Zara smiled as she watched Vincent interact with the children, noting how naturally he had embraced his role as not just a father, but a mentor to kids who saw him as proof that adults could admit their mistakes and work to make things better. "Actually," she said, addressing the table, but speaking particularly to Vincent, "there's something I wanted to share with all of you." The Morrison Foundation for Family Healing officially received its nonprofit status this week. The announcement was met with applause and cheers from around the table, but Zara's eyes remained fixed on Vincent as she continued, "Which means we can now formally begin providing free trauma counseling and family support services to any family dealing with loss, regardless of their ability to pay or their background." The foundation had been Vincent's idea, born from his recognition that his family's healing had only been possible because of his wealth and privilege, and his determination to ensure that other families wouldn't have to suffer as his sons had simply because they lacked access to quality mental health care. With Zara as its director and Marcus designing innovative community centers that would house the services, the foundation represented a concrete commitment to transforming personal pain into public good, ensuring that the lessons learned from their own struggle would benefit countless other families facing similar challenges. Linda Washington, Marcus's wife, reached across the table to squeeze Vincent's hand with genuine affection. "You know, when Marcus first told me about losing his job, I was so angry at your company, at the whole system that seemed designed to keep people like us from succeeding. I never imagined that someday we'd be sitting at your dinner table as family, watching our children play together and planning ways to help other families avoid what we went through." Her voice carried the weight of someone who had lived through real hardship, but had emerged stronger and more compassionate, her husband's vindication allowing her to transform bitterness into hope. The conversation was interrupted by Ethan tugging on Zara's sleeve, his face serious with the kind of important question that only children can ask with complete sincerity. "Mama Z, remember when you first came here and Mrs. Patricia was mean to you? Why did she think being different was bad?" The question hung in the air like a teaching moment, and Zara exchanged glances with Vincent before kneeling down to meet Ethan at eye level. "Well, sweetheart, sometimes people are afraid of things they don't understand, and that fear can make them say and do hurtful things. Mrs. Patricia grew up in a time and place where she was taught that some people were more valuable than others based on what they looked like, and she never learned to question those teachings." Zara's voice carried the patience of someone who had spent years helping children process difficult concepts, but also the firmness of someone determined to ensure that this generation would do better. The important thing is that we can choose to be different. We can choose to judge people by their actions and their character rather than their appearance or background. Evan nodded solemnly before adding his own observation with the brutal honesty of a 6-year-old. Mrs. Patricia was sad inside, wasn't she? That's why she was mean to people who were nice. The insight prompted a moment of contemplative silence around the table as the adults realized that even the children had recognized the fundamental unhappiness that drove Patricia's need to diminish others in order to feel important herself. Marcus cleared his throat and raised his glass of wine, his expression growing serious as he prepared to address the table. "I want to say something to all of you, especially to Vincent." He paused, gathering his thoughts as Linda squeezed his hand encouragingly. "A year ago, I was a broken man. I'd lost my job, my confidence, my belief that hard work and talent would be rewarded fairly in this country. I was angry and bitter, and I honestly didn't know how we were going to provide for our children or rebuild our lives." His voice grew stronger as he continued. "What happened next could have been a story about revenge, about using my sister's brilliance to destroy the people who had hurt us. But instead, it became a story about redemption, about the possibility that people can change, and systems can be reformed when good people decide to do the right thing." Vincent felt tears prick his eyes as Marcus continued. Vincent Morrison didn't have to believe Zara when she told him the truth about what had been happening in his company. He didn't have to take responsibility for mistakes he wasn't even aware he was making. He could have fired her, covered up the evidence, and continued business as usual. Instead, he chose to face uncomfortable truths and make difficult changes, and that choice has transformed not just our families, but our entire community. The transformation Marcus referenced was indeed remarkable and far-reaching. Morrison Industries had become a model for inclusive business practices, implementing blind hiring processes, mandatory bias training for all management personnel, and an independent oversight committee that included community representatives and former employees who had experienced discrimination. The company's commitment to diversity had actually improved its bottom line, bringing in new talent, expanding its client base, and generating positive publicity that had attracted investors interested in socially responsible businesses. But the changes extended far beyond corporate policy. The network of household managers that Patricia had been part of had been systematically exposed and dismantled, with several families choosing to part ways with domestic staff who had been using their positions to perpetuate discriminatory practices. 3 other companies in the Beverly Hills area had voluntarily implemented similar reforms after seeing Morrison Industries' success, and the local Chamber of Commerce had established new guidelines for member businesses regarding inclusive hiring and workplace culture. Zara stood up from the table, her expression growing thoughtful as she prepared to share something that had been weighing on her mind. "You know, when I first decided to take this job, I thought I was embarking on a mission of justice for my family. I was angry, determined to expose the people who had hurt Marcus and force them to face consequences for their actions." She paused, looking around the table at faces that had become dear to her in ways she had never anticipated. "What I discovered was that real justice isn't about punishment or revenge. It's about transformation, about creating systems and relationships that prevent future harm while healing the damage that's already been done." The wisdom of her words resonated with everyone at the table, but it was Vincent who spoke the response that captured what they were all feeling. "Zara, when you came into our lives, you didn't just heal my son's trauma or expose my company's problems. You taught all of us that courage isn't about being fearless. It's about being afraid, but doing the right thing anyway. You showed us that change is possible, that people can grow, and that families can be built on shared values rather than shared genetics." As if summoned by the emotional weight of the conversation, all 5 children appeared in the dining room doorway, their faces flushed from playing, and their eyes bright with the kind of happiness that only comes from feeling completely safe and loved. "Can we have dessert now?" Amelia asked with the straightforward priorities of childhood, prompting laughter from all the adults and effectively shifting the focus from heavy topics to the simple pleasure of ice cream and cake. As Zara served dessert and listened to the children chatter about their plans for the upcoming week, she reflected on how different this scene was from the tense, silent meals she had witnessed during her first weeks in the Morrison household. Ethan and Evan, once hollow-eyed and traumatized, now radiated confidence and joy, their capacity for empathy and understanding expanded by exposure to different perspectives and experiences. They attended a diverse school that Vincent had specifically chosen to broaden their worldview, and they spoke casually about their friends from different cultural backgrounds, as if such diversity were the most natural thing in the world. The evening wound down with the children playing together in the family room, while the adults lingered over coffee, their conversation ranging from business plans to vacation ideas to philosophical discussions about parenting and social responsibility. When Marcus's family finally gathered their belongings to head home, the goodbyes were filled with the warmth of people who knew they would see each other again soon, not just for formal dinners, but for birthday parties, school events, and the countless small moments that define real family relationships. After the guests left, Vincent found himself standing in his foyer with Zara and his sons, the same space where a year earlier their confrontation with Patricia had exposed truths that changed everything. "You know," he said quietly, looking around at the evidence of their transformed life, "I used to think that protecting my children meant sheltering them from difficult realities and maintaining the status quo that had brought our family prosperity. Now I understand that protecting them means teaching them to recognize injustice and giving them the tools to fight it." Zara nodded, her expression reflecting both satisfaction and ongoing determination. "The work isn't finished, Vincent. What we've accomplished here is just the beginning. Every family that receives help from the foundation, every person who gets a fair chance at employment, every child who grows up believing that their worth isn't determined by their race or background represents another step toward the world we want to create." As Ethan and Evan hugged Zara goodnight and ran upstairs to get ready for bed, their laughter echoing through the mansion like a promise of better days ahead, Vincent realized that the woman who had entered his life as a mysterious nanny had become something far more precious. A partner in the work of building a more just world, a role model for his children, and living proof that sometimes the people who challenge us most are the ones who love us best. The story that had begun with accusations and suspicion had transformed into something beautiful and lasting, a family bound not by genetics but by shared commitment to fairness and compassion, a business that proved profitability and social responsibility could coexist, and a community that was slowly but steadily becoming more inclusive and just. And as Vincent turned off the lights and headed upstairs to say goodnight to his sons, he carried with him the knowledge that the best revenge against those who try to limit our possibilities is living a life that proves them wrong, not through destruction, but through the patient, persistent work of building something better. If this story of transformation through courage and the power of choosing justice over revenge has touched your heart, remember that change begins with each of us recognizing our own capacity to do better. Subscribe to hear more stories that challenge us to examine our assumptions, question our systems, and work together to create a world where every child has the opportunity to thrive, regardless of the circumstances of their birth. Because sometimes the most radical act is simply refusing to accept that things have to stay the way they've always been, and having the courage to build bridges where others have built walls. The story of Zara Washington and the Morrison family became more than just a tale of justice served. It became a powerful reminder that sometimes the people who challenge us most deeply are the ones who love us best, and that true transformation happens not through revenge, but through the patient work of building something better than what came before. Zara's journey showed us that real strength isn't found in tearing others down, but in lifting entire communities up. That courage isn't about being fearless, but about doing what's right, even when it's difficult. And that the most profound victories come not from defeating our enemies, but from turning them into allies through understanding and compassion. This story teaches us that every person has the power to be an agent of change in their own life and in the lives of others. That families are built on love and shared values rather than genetics alone, and that the legacy we leave behind is determined not by what we accomplish for ourselves, but by how many doors we open for others to walk through. Vincent Morrison discovered that true leadership means taking responsibility for systems we didn't create, but have the power to change, while Patricia Wells learned that clinging to old prejudices ultimately destroys the very thing we think we're protecting. What about you? Have you ever encountered someone who seemed threatening at first but turned out to be exactly what you needed? Have you witnessed the transformation that's possible when people choose growth over comfort, justice over convenience? How do you think you would respond if you discovered that your own success had come at the cost of others' opportunities? These are the questions that define not just our character, but our humanity. And the answers we choose shape the world our children will inherit. If this story touched something deep within your heart, if it made you think differently about the power we all have to create positive change, we invite you to share it with someone who might need to hear this message today. Leave a comment below telling us about a time when someone surprised you by showing up as exactly the help you needed, or share your thoughts on how we can all do better at recognizing and challenging the systems of exclusion that exist in our own communities. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and ring that notification bell, because stories like these remind us that hope is always possible, that change always begins with individuals who care enough to act, and that the most beautiful chapters of our lives often start with the courage to write a different ending than the one everyone expects. Thank you for being part of this community of people who believe that every story matters, every voice deserves to be heard, and every person has the potential to be someone else's unexpected blessing.
Join us to share meaningful stories by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell to start your day with profound lessons and heartfelt empathy.